All right, we'll go ahead and get started here. I'll have some similar comments to what I opened with on the earlier panel, because we do have some new folks here who just couldn't get enough of the Heritage Foundation and cookies and all that good stuff. So it's good to have you all here. I have to remind myself, if you got a fancy phone or a non-fancy phone, please put it on silent. And then this is also being broadcast across the web. So when we get to the Q&A, if you'd identify yourself and who you're with before you get into your question. Again, a reminder from what I mentioned earlier that this is kind of a continuation of a series of things that the Heritage Foundation and the American Enterprise Institute have been kind of co-sponsoring as part of the Project for a Common Defense, which is really comprised of a lot of volunteer individuals, all experts in the national defense and security community, and really focused on ensuring we have national defense policies that are robust, that are clear, understandable, and well-resourced. In particular, though, this panel will also help to inform a new project that the Heritage Foundation has ongoing, the Index of U.S. Military Strength. So if you're familiar with the Index of Economic Freedom, now in its 20th year that the Heritage Foundation has been along publishing, we're attempting to do something similar to assess the adequacy and capabilities of U.S. military power in the world in which we live, and do that as an independent assessment so we can set some benchmarks and then kind of score what the nation is doing and how well it's funding it. I'd like to start this ground panel by introducing our moderator, Dr. Daniel Garay, Vice President with the Lexington Institute. He's been actively involved in a host of national security programs over his career. As a member of the 2001 DoD transition team, went on to serve as Director of the Office of Strategic Competitiveness for the Secretary of Defense. Has been a senior analyst on national security and defense issues with a number of organizations, just a couple of which are the Center for Naval Analyses and for the SAIC. Just prior to Lexington, he was the Deputy Director of the International Security Program at CSIS and has taught just about everywhere worth teaching. So we're really pleased to have him, PhD from Johns Hopkins in International Relations and Russian Studies, so you might be on call here to talk about what's going on in Eastern Europe. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dan, who will introduce the rest of our panelists, and we'll get into some discussion about ground warfare and ground force issues.
Just a few brief comments and words, because this is such a great panel. I want to give maximum time for everybody. I noticed that at least in the invitation, the title for this panel was Ground Warfare. And I think we shouldn't forget that. In fact, it looked like it was also naval warfare, because bottom line here, military forces are for war. They can do all kinds of other things. And in fact, they do all kinds of other things on a day-to-day basis. We heard about that at the last panel, and the list goes on and on. It's not a, contrary to what the president may think, it's not a hammer that turns every problem into a nail. It is, in fact, the most amazing, complex utility box of tools that one could possibly imagine. That having been said, if it cannot, the military, particularly the ground forces, cannot fight and win America's wars, then we have a fundamental problem. And frankly, the services have a fundamental problem. So I would suggest that let's at least keep one eye on the ball when we talk about the different issues. What kind of wars, against whom, obviously matters tremendously, scale, frequency, and all the rest. But ultimately, that has got to be the test. In addition, I would make the point that no form of warfare, maybe particularly ground warfare, but particularly ground warfare, exists in isolation. And in fact, if you didn't have the other services to get the ground forces to where they needed to be, we heard about amphibious warfare and the Navy-Marine combination, close combination or close interaction, just as an example, but it's true for the Army as well. You wouldn't have sort of a force that was particularly useful. Air power, the ability to dominate the third dimension and to exploit it, has been perhaps one of the most decisive features in changing the nature of ground warfare over the last 60, 70 years. So it's not when we talk about ground warfare, it's not to the exclusion of everything else. That having been said, as a colleague of mine recently noted, there are at least 8 different ways that the Army alone has a unique, U.S. Army has a unique capability, and one doesn't want to forget some of these things that it can do for the rest of the force, one of which I will mention at this point, which is the U.S. Army, not the exclusion of Special Operations Forces or the Marine Corps, is just about the last major land army standing in the West. And if we remember the famous line about quantity having a quality all its own, when we now think about the Army, size of the Army, composition of the Army, active reserve mix, it matters how much force you have. It matters for the others, and I'm sure the air panel will talk to you about why numbers matter. But nowhere does quantity matter more than when one is talking about serious land combat. So, with those remarks, let me introduce the panel very, very briefly. I know everybody here has not only cell phones and all the rest, but access to tablets and computers, so you can Google the hell out of everybody's background. But we have, going from my left to the far left, Frank Hoffman, Senior Research Fellow at National Defense University and a frequent writer on all kinds of issues related to land warfare. Nathan Freer is Associate Professor at the Army War College and has thought very deeply about sort of what happens to the Army, how it balances its various demands, particularly how it deals with coming out of an era of protracted stability operations. And Dave Maxwell, Associate Director of the Center for Security Studies at Georgetown University, who can give us yet another perspective. And I'm just going to go down the line from Frank to Dave and go from there. Frank, up to you.
Thank you very much. Dakota, thank you for the invitation. You've accomplished something. I've been in this town for more than 30 years, and I've never been to the Heritage Foundation. It is very true. And, so my bucket list is complete. This bronchitis I have might be the end of me, but I'll go to my grave happy now that I've been here.
And we serve cookies.
And you have good cookies, too. I'm really happy to be here. I'm very happy to be here with my friends, and the qualifications are a little more extensive since I believe three of us are retired infantry officers.
Ooh, that's really good.
With some experience, so I'm very happy to be here. We'll see if the presentation does work. I'd like to start out by discussing a couple of illusions, assumptions, propositions, and things that go for strategic guidance in this town at this point in time. The first is that retrenchment is both necessary and risk-free. We should discuss that a little bit, and that we can retool. We should retool right now. Although I don't hear good guidance on what it is we should be retooling to. There's a strong element in town, despite the fact that we've been at war for 12 years. There are a number of journals and think tanks that believe that war is waning and fading away to non-existence. And it's true that the number of conflicts that are going on around the world have diminished in number. But I'll give you a discussion point later, 7 reasons why I believe that the next 20 years is going to be a lot bloodier than the last 20, which is not a pretty thought. There's an assumption or assertion in town that manpower is very expensive, which is code for cut the Army because the Army is manpower intensive and we can save a lot of money there. And it is true that manpower has grown about 47 or 50% over the last decade, a lot of it health care, some of its benefits, and Congress has resisted some changes to bending that curve, but I don't think it should be used as an excuse to cut land forces, even if quantity does have a quality all its own. We're going to need some kind of a force. And there's larger increases in health care. The price of a carrier is rather expensive. And we're buying some very expensive airplanes which have game-changing capabilities in them, but they're also very expensive too. So cost shouldn't be the only factor. There's a few advocates in town. Some of them are friends of mine who want to embrace technology and are searching for disruptive technologies and game changers. They want to cut the Army now and then bet on these game changers. I don't mind searching for technology, investing in science and technology, but I'd like to know what the trade-off is before we make a lot of changes. And there's some illusions and commentary about the nature of the maritime character of the Pacific. Evasion and Pacific and rebalancing is very important. I can look at a map too, and I do see a lot of blue on it. But geography and history are still pretty relevant too, and there was a ground component element to World War II. There was a ground component to the Korea conflict, and there was a ground component in Vietnam. So even if the map does look like it has a lot of blue, those shades of brown and green aren't necessarily irrelevant either. So it would behoove us to take a look at that. If you've seen some of my writings on War on the Rocks, you know that I'm a little bit concerned. I really like this analogy between 2014 and 1914. There's a lot of similar elements in the nature of the international security environment. Rising powers, unsure alliances, proxy forces, small states that are allied with big states that drag people into things, black hand or extremist groups. There's some very interesting similarities, and I think we're getting a little bit close to being accused of some complacency in our understanding of the character of the international environment, and we're assuming too much about the kind of power system we've had and the nature and stability of the secure environment that I think is waning away. And I like what the economist said. We're, I think, getting borderline to being culpably complacent. And my rationale for this is in these 7 factors that I think are going to produce some bloody next 2 decades. And it's not necessarily an argument for land power, but it's an argument for thinking realistically and pragmatically and prudently about defense. And I think the first factor that's going to be, I think, apparent, if it's not already apparent in Europe today, is that the retrenchment of a hegemonic power, a unipolar period, usually does allow some states, miscreants, or states that have revisionist ambitions, to see opportunities and try to seize them. And we may have seen that already in the last year. Rising new powers, as Dan Applebaum's quote here kind of captures, are always an opportunity for transitions to cause miscalculations. I'm constantly amazed at how aggressive and assertive Chinese generals are in the media, and quite impressed with how assertive they are, not having reached a regional power projecting capability yet, not having an economy half of the size of the United States, or having a power projecting capacity probably a quarter of ours. They've got very big britches and a very loud, aggressive foreign policy stance. So just imagine in 7 to 10 years where they're going to be. I think it's going to say something. I think we're going to see reduced international support for peacekeeping. I think we see it already in Africa. We're going to see it in Europe. As our allies are older, smaller, and poorer, they're going to have to withdraw some of the support that they've given in the past that has ameliorated conditions in Africa and other places in the world. We're not going to be able to rely upon that much more. And that leads to this 4th problem, alliance decay. A great deal of our great power stability over the last 2 decades has been generously supported by our allies. Our European allies in particular are older, grayer, poorer, and are going to be more insular as their demographics change, and they become more insular and more interested in austerity and maintaining their welfare state. And so we're not going to have the kind of alliance structure or cohesion we had, at least from the Euro-Atlantic community in the past. A little slightly different story in the Pacific because China's scaring people. But Japan as a society is greatly in debt, much older, and smaller demographically in the future. So we're going to need a search for new alliances and revitalizing alliances we have. Proxy wars, 1914 is an example. Tragic, catastrophic consequences can drag people into things, and there are conditions in the world today that might permit that. Russia's, I think, the one I'm concerned the most. Technological proliferation, technological growth kind of cuts both ways. And I think when you have periods of time when there's dynamic and disruptive technologies and they're coming out of the private sector, not owned and controlled by arsenals or federal states, I think you create conditions in which some people think they have an advantage, and they might think that that advantage is transitory, so they might try to seize it. And I think cyber, perhaps some areas of WMD might present that. So the more technology or drones get out there, there's more an opportunity for someone to think that they have a advantage they need to take and seize right now, or they think they have something on us that maybe a military is not as relevant to. And then the 7th factor I think we'll see is resource competition. We're much in love with our own energy revolution right now. The shale gas thing does have great, huge geopolitical impact. It will destabilize some states, perhaps Russia, perhaps Iran, perhaps Nigeria, perhaps Venezuela, and all those might actually be to our benefit. But they'll create conditions, I think, for increased instability and perhaps missions for the United States. So it's something to think about the future. I wanted to talk a little bit about capacity, since Dan brought up this issue. This is I'm basically crowdsourcing my next paper. So feel free to write to me at francis.hoffman@ndu.edu. But I'm trying to get comfortable. I'm getting comfortable. Yeah, keep the profanity down. But Brian, that'd be hard for some people. But I basically have laid out here on the left-hand column 3 primary drivers for Army force structure. One mission is the main theater war, or major theater war, an MCO of some type. In the second category, I've put down both the deny campaign, which in the Pentagon speak is the second MTW, the one that ground forces allegedly have no play in whatsoever. And I would challenge that a little bit. I think it's probably minimalistic, but there's probably in a scenario in which we would have foreign bases and allies, we would be doing some deny campaign, we'd probably have some kind of security requirement for our own bases, our own forces, or make some contribution and some blood contribution to an alliance in some region or something. So there's a little bit of force structure that's kind of placed against that. And I've doubled up a scenario which Nathan and I have worked in the past on whether or not we really should plan for some kind of humanitarian or stability or disorder scenario. But I've doubled that up into the deny campaign, which might create a problem in terms of, not a problem of capacity, but I might shape those forces entirely different. And then the third category is the forward presence reassurance kind of thing where the Army's got some force structure. And what I've done across the top there is I've arrayed 3 levels of risk, high, medium, and low. And basically in brigade combat teams have tried to, in my own mind and some 10 or 15 years in the building thinking about force planning, what level of forces that I would place down for a 4 division with 3 brigades would be a high risk kind of MTW. But on the far side, if I had 5 divisions of say 4 brigades apiece, 20 brigade combat teams, I would be a little more comfortable with the risk scale. And I've done the same thing there with the deny campaign and with the levels of forward presence, how many brigades and what the rotation base is in that. And this gives you a range between the high risk of 24 brigades, which is where we're going in my estimation right now, and then where I think the Army should be struggling to try to maintain the 30 or 32 brigades, and where we've been in the 40s in the past, which we can't afford. That's an Army of 500K that we're walking back from. But I think if you look at the current budget situation, the current plan, and how Congress is hamstringing the Department of Defense in terms of not allowing BRACs, not allowing compensation change, not allowing any of the force structure change in the U-2s, the Apaches, ICBM changes, everything that the administration's asked for, the 30-some billion dollars in the FIT that represents as savings that the department's trying to shift is going to be applied to the forces. So the Marine Corps is going to be smaller than what they think it's going to be. It's going to be below 175. It's going to be in the 160s. And the Army is going to be closer to 390 and 400 at the way Congress is currently approaching this. Mm-hmm. And this is just a capacity slide to kind of get people comfortable with that kind of a conversation. And I'd be more than glad to have some debate on that. And I've made some assumptions down at the bottom of the slide, in particular the availability of the Marine Corps, of course, would have a ready brigade and sufficient lift to bring two combat assault echelons of 2 brigades to bear. And I've made some assumptions about the Guard that we don't talk very much about when we talk about land power and when we talk about risk. But if the Guard cannot put 6 brigades in the field in 60 days and another 6 brigades by 120 brigades, then my risk assessment starts getting higher and higher risk if the Guard can't get to that level of readiness. And the Guard needs to step up to that, because my father's Guard or my time as a reservist is not the kind of force level readiness we can count on if we're going to have a much smaller Army and a smaller Marine Corps, and we're going to rely upon the reserves, which I can and think we should, but I think we need to invest in that Guard of the future. And then the last slide, this is sort of a capabilities enhancement discussion if we want to talk about the things that I think we need. But I do think we need to get much better at global integrated capabilities. We're going to combine active and reserve forces. We're going to combine joint and interagency forces. We're going to combine SOF and general purpose forces. We're going to come from disparate locations, and we're going to come together in the field, sometimes for the first time, unfortunately. And we're going to have to operate effectively in the field. That's the first overall one. That's what the chairman's been pushing for the most. So here's my knock from my boss there. Check mark. The afternoon's covered. But for the ground forces, viable ground mobility forces, I believe both the Army and the Marine Corps are suffering from a lack of creative investment in ground mobility assets. The Marines have moved from their flat-bottom planing tank, fortunately, but the substitutes for that need to be invested in and developed. More engineering assets, and I think by engineering I actually meant more combat support in a broader sense. Some of that's going to be robotic. A lot of that could be unmanned on ground and air vehicles. The Marines are doing some wonderful work with logistics, UAV systems, and that's the kind of thing to start thinking more and more about. I'd like to see a long loiter, what I call urban-friendly overhead cover system, some kind of a fire support UAV for the Marines. I've been pushing that for a number of years. That could be both for ISR purposes, and it could be immediate fire support for smaller, more distributed ground forces. I'm not into mass quite as much, but I would invest some of our high-low mix capabilities in that, as well as the fast movers that the Marines are currently investing in. We need some responsive counter-battery fire, and we need some mobile defensive systems to counter guided rockets, artillery, munitions, and mines of the 21st century. We're getting a little bit better at the ground bottom problem, but I think in the future, with very cheap UAVs, very small, inexpensive systems. IEDs and EFPs of the future might be top-borne. And instead of being $150 and dug into the ground, they might be only $25, the size of a soda can, and they can be carried around $100, $150 UAV that most college kids are now running around colleges and driving up and down campuses with in the future. And I've already seen video, foreign and domestic, where that's not only achievable, but people are actually working towards that end. So that's something to think about for capability enhancements. And the last slide, I just want to repeat my concern with complacency. We have a tendency in this country to focus on wars we like, and I see a little bit of that reverting back into our language and defense guidance right now, and we need to be worried about that a little bit. We need to embrace our history. We've not reached the end of history. Geopolitics has not returned. It was always there. We just were ignorant about it. Russia didn't really change. You know, they don't think 1991 meant what we think 1991 meant. They didn't stop doing what they're doing, and the Chinese are just another continuation of history. So hopefully we won't get that lesson in our face. Many forms of war are possible. I think we'll see the full range. We're going to see the low-end wars. Dave Maxwell's an expert in this area, and I'll let him talk to the far left of the bang. But I think we're going to see, as my good friend Colin Gray said, it's the one thing we can guarantee it's going to be a bloody century. The thing we can't guarantee is the kinds of war it'll probably be everything from the low and the high, and then the messy hybrid in the middle. And so I got my word hybrid in for the day, so
Yeah.
I probably achieved my fire superiority. And the last thing, I'm not necessarily against with the administration where we've gone with where we are with our guidance and our budget right now, but as a measure of prudence and balance, you know, joint forces will have some land component to that. Might not be as big as some of us want to be. I would hope that it's balanced, it's ready, it's prepared, and as well as equipped as we can make it be. Strategic rating does have a place in our strategy, and our standoff capabilities are unsurpassed, and I wouldn't necessarily cut them, but I don't think they're as decisive as a fully balanced force could be. And with that, I'll just leave you with a very, very depressing quote from, we're off. I'll turn it over to
Thank you for
Nate.
that. Thanks. Nate, next to you.
Okay, thanks. First of all, Dakota, thanks a lot for including me in this. I'll say the thing that Frank actually failed to say, because we both have to say this. I'm speaking on my own behalf and not on behalf of the United States government or the United States Army War College.
Thank you, Frank.
Yeah. So anyway, we're both covered, buddy. So look, what I want to do is I think I'd like to have you walk away with 4 basic points from what I'm going to say, and I'll probably say it in an overly complex way. I'll probably mess it up, but just as insurance against that, doing that, let me just make these 4 basic points. First, I think right now the decision-making framework within which we're deciding on defense capabilities is actually incomplete. I'll go into that in some more detail in a bit. It's natural why it's incomplete. We have resource constraints, we're war-weary, all the normal sort of narrative things you've heard over time about why it is that we're trying to sort of turn to some of the solutions Frank talked about as far as technological solutions or the end of history with respect to ground warfare, et cetera. I mean, the bottom line is that framework's incomplete, and I'll go into some detail on that. Now, the second thing, and I think this is this happens to be a specifically kind of an Army problem. I really wish they put the land back in land power, right? Because I don't use the term land power a lot, largely because it's become a little bit problematic and become a little bit too much of a bumper sticker. But let me just point this out. The problem is really with the narrative right now that many are trying to sell with respect to land power is they base it on what I call, cutely I guess, sort of an abstract parable about humans living on land and the Army being the only arbiter, or the ground forces being the only arbiter between that. And really, that's not the point. The point about ground forces is the fact that they operate on and from land, right? And that in the Army specifically, not to dwell down on that, but the Army specifically operates over sustained periods at a significant amount of, at a significant resource level on land. And that's the point. It's not, the human dimension, as it were, yeah, that's kind of a natural sort of, that's a natural component of that, but the point really is that When you're talking about ground forces, you're talking about the ability to project power, operate for extended periods of time, and achieve some objective on land. And so that's my whole my idea of putting land back in land power. Look, the one thing that Frank did that I'm not going to do, in my mind, it's not about the numbers. It's really not about, there are clearly numbers below which the Army or the Marine Corps or Special Operations Forces become dangerously at risk of not being able to achieve their objectives. But first, going back to my first point, you got to get the decision-making context right. If the frame is right within which you're building the force, the number will naturally lend itself to that. You'll build a force that's appropriate to the frame. If we get that first right, we'll get the number right. The real question is capabilities. What in fact is it you want your ground forces to be able to achieve over time? And I should actually, noting that my buddy John Barry is here and Frank's on the stage with me, whenever I refer to ground forces, I really do mean sort of the triad, right? I'm talking about the Army, the Marine Corps, the ground combat elements of the Marine Corps, and SOF, okay? I'll talk at specific points about each one, but I really do believe in the triad. I'm a very ecumenical guy in spite of my past, and by the way, I'm an artillery officer, if you're referring to me. Anyway, but capabilities are more important than numbers. Yeah, it does, actually. And then I'd like to make a final point on Dan's opening observation on fighting and winning being foundational. Absolutely believe that. I mean, the real question, the outlier question out there is fighting and winning what kind of war, under what circumstances, et cetera. That's an open question, I think. But I go further than that, and in that, and you'll see a chart that I'll briefly show that talks about, look, the ground forces are really, they really are the federal government's slack to do almost anything on a contingency basis that exists when you really think about it. So, do I mean that in a domestic sense? Not necessarily, but what I mean is any nasty, complex foreign contingency operation that requires some amount of sustained effort on the part of the United States will likely occur on the back of some land component. And that could be the Marines, it could be SOF, it could be the Army, or it could be all three, right? But the point is there is this handyman aspect to ground forces that I think is many times lost in the debate. So with that, I think it's forward, is that right, Frank, this one right here? With that?
Artillerymen should be looking.
Yeah, I know.
If a
Look,
good run.
I know, the last math class I took was as a junior in high school, and then somehow the Army put me in the artillery, I don't know, but anyway. So here's the quote from the Secretary of War that I really like and I really think is actually really the most important point, this last point I made. American military has become the all-around handyman of the government, right? And really what he was talking to there is he was talking to the Army and probably the Marine Corps at the time. But what I like about this quote is, in my mind, and having just done a discussion on military advantage, where I included some of these remarks in it, the United States, military advantage for the United States really hinges not just on our ability to fight and win wars, full stop. It really hinges on our ability to address a broad spectrum of contingency demands with joint military forces that are agile enough to swing sort of from the left to the right limit of what they might be asked to do. So, let me go. Now, I use probably too cute by halfway to describe what it is the joint force needs to be able to do, but I do it in these 6 words that I think sort of are related to things we do with our hands, basically, right? Punch, grab, block, push, knock out, and help, right? Those 6 things are really what, as a bottom line, we ask our military to do. And if you actually look at sort of demand over the previous 20, 30 years, and look forward to the next 20 or 30 years, all of these actually tend to endure through any possible contingency that you can think of. So I'll talk about those in a little more detail in a second. Next, the decision-making frame, right? Here's where my biggest beef is with current decision-making, and this really most affects the future of ground forces, okay? So for about 5 years now, really since the last QDR, I said there's 2 fundamental questions that are going to be very important for DoD to answer. They have now answered them, all right? The first question is given the obvious constraints that are emerging in resources and given war weariness, is DoD likely to situate its appreciation as opposed to appreciate its situation, right? And do so in a way that suits its very traditional biases, the ability to sort of mathematically calculate the outcomes of war and therefore build a force structure that is testable against a set of contingencies. I think absolutely QDR-14 has re-traditionalized the defense problem in that respect, especially as Frank pointed out with these two contingencies they point out. It has reset contingencies that most conform to our traditional biases, and it clearly postures the force for what we prefer to be challenges, and also challenges that are scientifically really testable, okay? The second question that I commonly ask, right, or that I've asked over the last 5 years, is will the most important defense problems that emerge for the United States over the next decade plus, will it emerge from unfavorable order or disorder, right? Unfavorable order is bad states, hostile states, adversary states exercising their power in a way that's unfavorable to the United States and manifests itself in some military way. Disorder is somewhat the complete opposite of that. It's the dissolution of authority or the erosion of authority to such an extent that it causes a failure of order in a state or region that somehow fundamentally threatens a core interest of the United States. Now, in reality, my answer to that is both of them. You can see both of them very much in play right now, all the way from sort of, the classic problem in Asia with a rising China, all the way to a very murky, mixed kind of problem in the Ukraine, down to the darker manifestations of the Arab awakening. So, but this is largely a question, or at least an issue, that's unanswered in the current defense debate, right? So that's ergo kind of my conclusion. The defense decision-making frame is clearly incomplete in my mind. Raw military science has prevailed over social science, right? You have sort of what's going on from a social science perspective in the world, which has these two competing problems that the United States has to address, where you have sort of military science achieving primacy, the testable, manageable way to look at it. What we've done in the process is we've preserved our ability to punch, and we've preserved our ability to push, right? And knockout has been preserved in our nuclear deterrent. But all the other aspects in there, sort of the grab, block, et cetera, are somewhat at risk as a result. Now, I'm not going to go into great detail on this because Frank talked about it, but just bear in mind that DoD has established four force structure blocks, right? Essentially. They've established the deny, decisive defeat, defend the homeland, sustain counter-terrorist operations. And then their fifth sort of tenet of their force planning construct is the deter and assure tenet. And we all know that really is, that comes from the deny and defeat bin. So it's not necessarily a steady state thing as much as it's forces that are borrowed from those bins to go out and do forward presence, et cetera. So that's the official view of the world. Now, my view, again, that I've actually had for quite some time, isn't much different than that, but where I think they've fundamentally probably got something that they could readdress and think through, is in their two major contingencies, in my mind, are more likely to emerge from the first, which is their preferred right now, which is I kept the HEAT acronym, but from the high-end asymmetric threat, right? The rising China, things like that. You can definitely keep that in the bin. But I think their second major problem that they need to think about is a major consequential disorder problem, right? Collapsed Pakistan, collapsed Saudi Arabia, sort of civil war going all the way from the Mediterranean all the way to the Arabian Sea, et cetera. Those are probably in the more likely bin. And frankly, I would put what's going on in the Ukraine technically as somewhat of a disorder problem, because really what you have is a proxy. You have a state power sort of free riding on a failure of authority in an adjacent state. So in my view, these two blocks are the more important. And if you preserve at the highest level of intensity your ability to do a disorder challenge, say in a failed North Korea, right, where you have to respond to a North Korea that's collapsed, you preserve, as you see in the middle of this chart, the capability to do your limited traditional campaign, right? So all the things you would require in a limited traditional campaign, and largely all the competencies, maneuver warfare, fire support, et cetera. All of those competencies would remain resident in the force, but your force would also be much more attuned to actually dealing with a 360-degree battlefield under very complex circumstances. So just a small advertisement. I'm going to talk about the narrative. The narrative, in my mind, for the ground forces is crystal clear, right? Ground forces do 5 things in my mind, and they have a foundational function as well. They do humanitarian response, distributed security, enable and support actions, peace operations, and limited conventional campaigns, right? That lays over the top of the theater setting capability that's resident in the United States Army, right? That's one of those non-negotiable foundational platforms that the entire Joint Force operates on. Now, we came to this conclusion in a recent CSIS report that while I was still with CSIS. This was our conclusion. This, in my mind, is the narrative, especially for the Army. If you drill down on what the Army needs to be able to do, it really is, respond to crises, human-based crises, conduct operations against disorder where they can seize secure property, populations, critical infrastructure, et cetera, enable and support the efforts of third parties, conduct peace operations, obviously interpositional between warring factions, and then finally conduct a limited conventional campaign. The word limited in this context is purposeful in that, look, we're in a new era. We're not going to be changing regimes anytime soon. So whatever conventional campaign we get into in the future is largely going to be focused on status quo antebellum, and therefore you have to plan on forces that are capable of doing that. So look, let me just wrap with this one thing. So regardless of mission, function, or role, future ground forces must be the following things. First, they have to be persistently tested in various operational contexts. The Arctic is becoming more important, right? The Asia-Pacific region obviously is becoming more important. There's a very diverse sort of array of geography and functional challenges that will face ground forces, and they need to be prepared for. Frank pointed out they need to be easier to deploy, employ, and redeploy, okay? The mobility problem Frank pointed out, I'd like to echo as well as lethality and survivability. The bottom line is the Marine Corps and sort of half of the Army really has a mobility and survivability problem that needs to be addressed. If you had to have to trade structure to address that, that's fine. That's probably okay. Obviously, the buzzwords, adaptable, tailorable, and scalable, but this goes back to my idea of the handyman. General purpose forces are important specifically because they're general purpose. They can do almost anything you need them to do, from their warfighting task all the way down to filling sandbags on the Red River in North Dakota, right? So it's a very important function and slack in the federal government. They need to be flatter, more expeditionary, and last point about distributed operations is critical. There's going to be less sinew that connects forces on the ground, less hard logistical and communicative sinew that connects those forces on the ground, and therefore they have to be somewhat more self-sustaining as they go forward. And then finally, one final plug, we have to integrate between our services, meaning Army, Marine Corps, and SOF to a certain extent. I count SOF as a separate service. We have to integrate between our components. We have to find ways to leverage the reserve component and mixed composition units and organizations that have reserve component and active force. Hybrid would be great. Absolutely. But then finally, to Dan's point, we actually have to integrate with those allies and partners around the world that maintains still relatively formidable ground force capabilities, and maintain a close connection with them, because actually we have become sort of the hub around which they get better and are able to operate. So with that, I'll leave it over to you.
Thanks, Nate, and thank also Dakota for the opportunity to participate. I am going to talk about special operations, Frank. Even though I was an infantry officer, I did end up as a special forces officer. I'm going to make 4 main points. I want to talk about unconventional warfare and the importance of unconventional and political warfare, and then our need to be able to counter our adversaries in their conduct of unconventional warfare. I'll touch briefly on technology and force structure versus strategy, and I want to mention talk about the soft activities of special warfare and surgical strike and achieving the proper balance. And then last, I'm going to talk about the small footprint, and I want to say beware the small footprint as a silver bullet. I think the future is going to be characterized by a lot of unconventional warfare, perhaps not conducted by us, but certainly by many of our adversaries. As I've written in the past, though, unconventional warfare is not an exclusive special operations or special forces mission. It's in fact a strategic interagency joint mission. And we need to understand that unconventional warfare is a strategic mission to coerce, disrupt, or overthrow a government, and that's executed through tactical forces, generally special operations is the main effort, through and with undergrounds, auxiliaries, or guerrilla forces in the denied area. But it's a strategic level decision to consider that as an option. It's not also not a silver bullet, not a war winner, but it's a strategic option. But most importantly, most of our adversaries, or many of our adversaries, are conducting some forms of unconventional warfare, and our understanding of unconventional warfare can inform our ability to assess their strategies and then to develop strategies to counter that form of warfare. I won't go back to World War I, but I'd go back to post-World War II, and I'm reminded of George Kennan, and obviously containment was his what he's known for. But in 1948, he wrote a memo, the policy planning staff memo, on the inauguration of organized political warfare. And let me quote this opening to that. Political warfare is the logical application of Clausewitz doctrine in time of peace. In broadest definition, political warfare is the employment of all means at a nation's command, short of war, to achieve its national objectives. Such operations are both overt and covert. They range from such overt actions as political alliances, economic measures, and white propaganda, to such covert operations as clandestine support of friendly foreign elements, black psychological warfare, and even encouragement of underground resistance in hostile states. I think very prescient. There's a lot of comparison post-World War II and now coming out of the situation that we've been in post 9/11. Although that was written, there was no active special operations capability at the time. OSS had been disbanded. CIA had just been restarted. But this was really a good description of how to think about the future in terms of special operations. And even though this was U.S.-centric, I would argue that just like our unconventional warfare definition, it is not U.S. exclusive. And in fact, I think that we're seeing adversaries such as Russia in Crimea and Ukraine. We're seeing even the Chinese in their three warfares. We're seeing Iran in Syria. We're seeing in other Iranian operations by the Quds Force, and even Al-Qaeda using terrorism as part of an unconventional warfare strategy to coerce, disrupt, and in some cases, to try to overthrow governments. So what I would argue is that we need to have an ability to be able to counter unconventional warfare. The recent publications from both the Polish and Latvian defense organizations have really laid out very well Russian information warfare and next generation warfare, which are fundamentally political and unconventional warfare, as I've described it. If you read those documents, you really get a sense that they're the ones that are channeling George Kennan. And the Russians have also shown a real capability to blend special operations, indigenous elements, and conventional forces to achieve their strategic objectives. And of course, the question is, how do we counter those ways and means? We should recall that the 5 U.S. activities of irregular warfare in the DoD Instruction 3000.07 are unconventional warfare, foreign internal defense, counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, and stability operations. And while these are useful, what is really necessary is, again, to understand our adversary strategies and then devise ways to counter unconventional warfare. And an externally supported insurgency or resistance may only be a small part of the challenge we face. We need to look really at the broader enemy strategy of our adversaries and not get overly focused on counterinsurgency. And I know that sounds strange, but in this context, I think counterinsurgency is very narrowly focused. The problems and the challenges are bigger than insurgency. Let me just make a point about technology and force structure. Obviously, they're critically important. I support, developing, as Frank said, advanced technology. We should search for ways to improve our technological capabilities, including our Iron Man suit and the like there. But we also need to focus on policies and, most importantly, balanced and coherent ends, ways, and means of strategy, and integrated campaign plans. And that's really the key. But most importantly, as I'll continue to make the point, we've got to learn how to attack the enemy's strategies. And while we invest in future equipment and platforms, we have to remember that education and training, and particularly for special operations, overseas presence are the foundation for training and educating our personnel. And of course, in these times of fiscal constraint, we've got to be able to balance the modernization and the pursuit of that cutting-edge technology with, of course, near-term readiness and support to sustained operations as SOF continues to conduct sustained operations overseas while educating the force for the future. And this is a real challenge for every single service and U.S. SOCOM. And there are no easy answers. I wish I could give you that. But we've got to be able to prioritize, and my bias is, of course, train and educate our force as the priority. I also make the point that for those who think that SOF is the answer to everything, or that we should grow SOF at the expense of the other services, I think that's a big mistake. We should recall that the 2006 QDR is the one that really initiated SOF growth. And for Army Special Forces, that 2006 directed growth wasn't complete until 2013. But the fact is, all the joint SOF are dependent on the services. And as we draw down service or personnel, there will be less personnel available for special operations. So I think as Nate has really laid out very well, we need to be thinking about using the right forces for the right missions. SOF is not a replacement for ground forces, and I think if we make that decision, that we will do ourselves long-term harm. But SOF is a part of the ground force, and I'm heartened to note in the Army capstone concept, I think some 7 times they talked about conventional and special operations interdependence. I think that is a lesson learned over the last decade plus, and it is one that needs to carry to the future. And the Army, as I understand it, just decided to make special operations an Army core competency, which I think is also a recognition of the importance of an integrated ground force, Army, Marine Corps, and special operations. But within special operations, the new Army doctrine lays out that the activities are really come in 2 categories. The first is surgical strike, which of course is the execution of activities in a precise manner that employs special operations in hostile, denied, or politically sensitive environments to seize, destroy, capture, exploit, recover, or damage designated targets or influence adversaries and threats. We have the greatest surgical strike capability in the world. Special warfare is the execution of activities that involve a combination of lethal and non-lethal actions taken by a specially trained and educated force that has a deep understanding of cultures and foreign languages and proficiency in small unit tactics and the ability to build and fight alongside indigenous combat formations in a permissive, uncertain, or hostile environment. These 2 are really the yin and yang of special operations. In the past we've characterized them as direct and indirect, but they really describe the activities of special operations. We've got to achieve the right balance between those 2 capabilities. And again, that's a real challenge. Now lastly, I want to talk about small footprint operations. They are very useful, but they're not the panacea. And even as we hear the strategic direction, coming from the President, this week or this past week, small footprint operations by themselves are not successful. And if we've had some success, they're really successful not because of the size, but because of the way that they were conducted. Many look to the Philippines and Colombia as models. I'm very hesitant to ever say that there's a model for anything. Every situation is different and unique, but there are some things that we can look at. We took a special warfare approach to counterinsurgency and counterterrorism in the Philippines, and the mission we basically conducted was foreign internal defense. Philippines was a very complex threat environment with multiple insurgencies, to include a communist insurgency, by the way. But really the key to operations in the Philippines rested on a number of things, first being assessment. While we went to Afghanistan in September and October of 2001, in October of 2001, Special Operations Command Pacific deployed elements to conduct a top-to-bottom assessment and thoroughly analyzed the problems that we faced and that our allies faced in the Philippines. And from that, it informed the campaign plan and the long-term strategy. We didn't have to execute in extremis as we did in Afghanistan. So we're able to conduct a deliberate assessment and conduct continuous assessment. And that's a foundation of special operations, but it's something to keep in mind, that these types of operations where we are helping friends, partners, and allies, they really have to rest on understanding the situation and conduct continuous assessment. In the Philippines, we conducted special warfare, but no surgical strike, and I think that's important to also remember in the Philippines that we truly operated through and with, and the Philippine forces were the lead element, and it was their country, their fight, and that was not a cliche that we operated through and with. The mission statement, I think, is informative. The Joint Special Operations Task Force, in coordination with the country team, I think an important word there, build capacity and strengthen the Philippine security forces so that they could defeat terrorist organizations in order to protect Philippine and U.S. interests from terrorist attack while preserving Philippine sovereignty. I think those 2 points in a mission statement, in coordination with the country team, critically important, and focus on Philippine sovereignty. Those words informed how the mission was conducted. And it is something to keep in mind, the fact that when we went to the Philippines, the U.S. forces were not in charge of the operations. And that's why I think it's not a good model, because some people would say, well, why couldn't you do that in Afghanistan and Iraq? The conditions were vastly different. And so we need to be careful and say, Colombia, Philippines, we should do that everywhere. Well, it may have application in other parts of the world, and there are lessons to learn from it, but we should not consider it a model or a silver bullet as the way to do things in the future. Lastly, about counterinsurgency, I think that we need to maintain a deep understanding and expertise in counterinsurgency, but I think the real issue is that we need to try in the future, if there are insurgent threats, that we approach it from a foreign internal defense perspective, where it is U.S. government, joint interagency, providing advice and assistance to a friend, partner, ally in their internal defense and development programs to defend themselves against lawlessness, subversion, insurgency, and terrorism. The focus is on helping them, not on doing it for them. And I think that's something that we need to keep in mind for the future. And with that, I will stop and take questions.
Great, perfect time. We have about a half an hour for questions and comments. The only rule is wait for the microphone and then identify yourself before asking your question. Do I have anybody
We're making their political statement.
in the back, behind you?
Jim Obrasky, Strategic Insight. How do you create an Army personnel policy that will allow rapid switch between warfare modes and warfare types and the underlying modes within them, so that you don't have decisive initial campaigns followed by losing the war? And the second question is,
Doesn't want to
and
create
it goes with the same one, by the way, is, okay, we have a whole herd of people who are immensely well qualified in unconventional warfare right now. We're going to many will be leaving the service. How do you take advantage of their expertise to create a networked joint interagency capability?
Anybody want to take a crack?
I'll try that. So switching between modes of war, I mean, one of the problems I think that I see going forward is that we're going to think of it in those terms, right? Like, I think that we're going to believe that we're going to have sort of a capability to do the Kuwaiti border to Baghdad, and then we're going to have a capability to do the policing up after that, and I don't think that they can't be mutually exclusive, to be perfectly honest. I mean, that's why I do think an agile, you're looking for a force that's agile enough to do all of that. Now, it's a tall order. One of the things I think that we can do, that the Army, I think, should, the Army specifically, and the Marine Corps probably too, as it sort of goes through its mission cycle, train up for things like regional aligned forces, is as you're taking a unit from ground level all the way up to being the regionally aligned force for Region X, what you do is you focus all of their preparation. As it stands right now, they all get prepared for sort of major combat, right? And then they get farmed out to their region to do whatever it is they need to do in the region, engage with a partner, sort of do security, institution building, et cetera. What they really, I think in my mind, should do is the regional aligned force should first and foremost be a contingency force for that region. And by that, different regions are gonna have different contingencies. I mean, Sub-Saharan Africa is gonna have a whole host of sort of human-based contingency operations. The Far East is gonna have a different type. Eastern Europe clearly has a different type, the Middle East, et cetera. So, for example, using the construct I set up, you will have, let's say the regional aligned force for regional aligned forces for Northeast Asia. Clearly, the major combat operations skill is important there because of the lingering problem with North Korea. The Middle East, probably not, right? The Middle East is probably more, in my mind, likely to generate major disorder problems. And from that perspective, you're in the sort of distributed security mode, and you're gonna have to train to sort of operate in a distributed fashion to secure populations, infrastructure, et cetera. It's a different mindset. But the force itself, as it transitions to a different phase of the operation, needs to really be able to do that as a force.
Let me just add to that. I think that I'm really bullish on our soldiers, sailor, airmen, and Marines. I think we spend a lot of time worrying about how they're going to adapt, how they're going to learn. I think our tactical forces have proven to be very adaptable and to learn their lessons and to be able to deal with problems. I think that what we really need to focus on, particularly inside the Beltway here, is getting the policy and strategy right. Get that right, and the services outside the Beltway, they will train the forces and they will employ them correctly. So I think that we spend a lot of time here looking at the tactical aspects of our military, and there are smart people out there that in the services that know how to employ their forces tactically. The personnel policies, that is an issue. I mean, obviously, and if you listen to Don Vandegrift, we have an industrial age personnel management system, which I think is true to all the services, and it's hard, even in soft, to maintain regional expertise because of those personnel policies that apply. That come from DOTMA, that come from Goldwater-Nichols, and so it's difficult. And as Nate said, as a regional BCT trains up, they're not able to maintain a true regional focus because of those personnel policies. There really does need to be a change to those policies, and it's there's got to be the correct balance between centralized management and decentralized management, and that's that's an oxymoron, I think. But there's got to be some central control, but there's got to be a lot of decentral control out in the field to be able to put the right person in the right place. And our personnel for a sufficient period of time, if you want to develop regional expertise, and the personnel policies don't support that at this time.
Let me go over here, and then I'll go to you.
Timothy Walton, Alios Consulting Group. Thank you very much for excellent presentations. One of the topics that you discussed is for major contingency operations that are more of the deny category. It seems that the Army may be playing more of a supporting instead of a traditionally supported role as part of the joint force. Because of that, it seems maybe some components of the Army force might be more important, be they engineering, defensive, offensive fires, surface deployment distribution, etc. How is the Army going to be able to grow or improve those capabilities while at the same time looking at some of its other core competencies such as BCTs?
Yeah.
Yeah, Tim, I think it's a really good question. And even though my focus on my matrix there is about really ground maneuver organizations, one has to consider the Army and the Air Force both have major theater opening capabilities and ISR, C2, but for the Army, for ports, airfields, other things too. So one shouldn't lose sight of that there is a role for the land power, but it's mostly an enabling and supporting role. And my emphasis was on just security and other things that people, I think, are overlooking that can also add to that. But I think you've made a major point there. And the one thing you could be a little more explicit about, particularly in Asia Pacific, but the potential for missile defense capabilities and reshaping the force to emphasize that as opposed to large, massive ground forces, which may not have the same probability of employment in certain areas. And there's been some pretty good articles discussing that, but I think that's something to talk more about, reshaping the Army, not as well as probably downsizing it, or at least getting it thinner, getting rid of some of its top heaviness.
That's a great question. That's one, again, if you look, if you think back to my chart, the enable support sort of mission that I talk about there is precisely that, right? It's the everything but fighting mission that in large measure Army forces do, right? Which is exactly as you said, surface logistics, air and missile defense, potentially long-range precision fires, to include at some point like precision anti-ship fires. And I think it's really important that the Army looks at that very carefully. The problem I have is, philosophically, there are those that believe that's all the Army should be thinking about right now, right? That for example, the anti-access area denial mission in the Asia Pacific region is the only job, right? And that all other jobs are kind of subservient to that. So to the extent, and again, I don't make a size argument here, I'm simply making a capabilities argument. There is going to be a zero-sum trade-off between building long-range precision fire capabilities, more surface logistics, more command and control, all the things that the Army provides in the theater setting. That's an important job. The Army clearly recognizes that, right? But there are those that will say it's a zero-sum between combat capabilities and those capabilities. And I'm sensitive not just from a parochial Army perspective. I'm sensitive from a readiness perspective that you may be betting wrong on that, right? So here's one of the things I've been thinking about lately, and this is probably fairly controversial thinking about it. I mean, it strikes me that your warning time associated with a major theater campaign in the Asia Pacific region with, for example, the Chinese, might be such that you could have a lot of what seems to be discussed as being enhancements to the Army with respect to this enable and support mission. You could actually transition a lot of that to the reserve component, right? Where you have a very balanced active component with combat capabilities and support capabilities. And then you have a good chunk of those surge, to include air and missile defense, by the way, a good chunk of those surge sort of major theater setting capabilities in the reserve component, potentially even pre-poed on the West Coast, right? And in Hawaii, so they're in the right place too. So I just think that there's more to this question than the simple China's the problem, so everybody get ready for that, right? And we want to fight big land wars, because I'm not in this camp, and I'm certainly not in that camp, right? It's more about balance.
Let me just make a quick point. I think what you just described, Tim, are the enabling capabilities, and they're important to special operations as well. And I hope that we don't go back to the Cold War time where we had forces above the line and below the line, because many of those enabling capabilities, which in the past would have been below the line and not manned and equipped at the highest readiness levels, they are needed for sustained operations besides major combat operations. SOF depends on them, other services depend on them. So again, it's finding the right balance between all those forces. That's really the real challenge for the Department of Defense. And but those forces, again, if you want to depend on special operations, if that's your argument, you're going to be dependent on many of those enabling capabilities as well. So again, I can't emphasize enough, you can't cut the Army and expect to replace it with special operations forces.
Brian McGrath from the Hudson Institute. Nathan, I want to tease out that last bit a little more. I think about the Army and the National Guard, and I think about the two big tasks from the Army operating concept. Combined arms warfare and wide area security.
They actually have three now. The support one is like a third one now.
Support,
They,
okay.
they
Support
acknowledge
civils.
they acknowledge their wider support, but anyway, I'm sorry.
Does the Army National Guard structure have it right? You keep talking about a balanced force. But would there be some virtue in moving more of this wide area security, manpower, and responsibility to the National Guard, who respond to governors who generally tend to want that kind of skill at their disposal anyway? Is proportion right?
No, that's a fair question. The first thing I'd say is governors like tanks
And helicopters.
and helicopters.
We all do.
Right? So, and I'm not trying to be pejorative here, it's just that they do. So, and that's an eminently political, as you know, we're getting a commission out of this, right? Here's the problem with that, I think. I think it's a great, I mean, I've always said that too. Look, the missions are so similar, right? Like sort of the civil control and things like that are similar. What I would, in a perfect world, what I would like to see is not necessarily that sort of division, and I'll tell you why that division isn't particularly right, because politically, while it will make the prospect of policing another hostile, disordered state less likely, because most of that capacity is in your sheriff's department and in your hospital and in your hardware store downtown and not in your active army. It's pretty politically unpalatable to say, look, the Army's gonna take Baghdad and the National Guard's gonna police Fallujah, right? You know, it doesn't seem to be politically a runner. What I would say, though, from the combat forces perspective, this is just Nate Fryer talking out there on TV. I think that the Guard combat forces should be motorized and infantry-based. And I say that, right, those two words I pick specifically. Motorized means they're on wheels, right? And infantry-based means exactly that. They are manpower intensive. So that's for the combat forces, because I think that sort of the motorized concept fits their state mission. You know, the equipage for that mission would fit their state mission very well. You could see them on Strikers, or you could see them on MRAPs, or whatever it is. Fits their state mission, but at the same time will fulfill some important role in foreign contingency operations. Frank's point on the 60 days and 120 days, I think you said, is very important. By the time we get to 60 days, I cannot foresee, really, I mean, I cannot see a large-scale conventional operation sort of going past 120 days, right? So a lot of times you are gonna see those reserve, I mean, the policing part of it might go beyond. I'm talking about the sort of cross the border and take a regime down, or cross the border and go back to status quo antebellum. Right now in the contemporary environment, I'm not sure we actually have the staying power for that, right, materially. But my point is those Guard forces are gonna be late arriving regardless of what the circumstances are, and their missions are gonna be more attuned to sort of critical infrastructure security, route security, post-conflict security, et cetera. So I think that your point, your philosophical point is a correct one. The question is, how do you actually make it happen? And I think the way you make it happen is you do sort of think about your active army being a little heavier, but that's a problem too, because you got to get to the fight, but a little heavier, and your Guard being a little lighter, and your Guard being a little less intensive in sort of fire support, heavy maneuver, et cetera, right?
Unfortunately, this is not a rational exercise in force planning in which the high-tech combined arms force design stuff would be echeloned across time in a logical way. You're going to have a combat role for the National Guard, if only to keep the overreaching feds up here in Washington at bay for some, you know, in some degree. But it would make sense if you could organize, and I've taken stabs at, you know, stability brigades that could be both domestic response capacity that would work with Homeland Security and with governors that would have an MP or an infantry basis, a truck company, a medical company, a comm company, and a headquarters, and people were familiar with Homeland Security tasks and kind of things. And then that kind of capability could be your phase 4 kind of thing. And you basically get a twofer out of these things. You'd have a domestic response capacity with command and control, a lot of young, healthy people, and you can get to a fire, a mountain pass challenge, or an urban kind of thing. But again, that's thinking rationally about our force needs, and that's not what the Guard's force structure is about.
So let me, just one last point I'd like to make. The horse is largely out of the barn on this particular issue. However, one thing I would like to point out is we probably, I haven't done the numbers myself, however, we probably could have achieved Frank's 40 to 42 brigades had we opted, instead of downsizing brigades and rounding out the 3rd maneuver battalion in every brigade with an active battalion, and instead done that with a Guard battalion. Now, the Guard would have been very unpopular with the Guard because it would have meant disaggregating the Guard and using them sort of at the battalion level and not at the brigade and division level. But what it would have done, because if you needed brigades in a hurry, you needed full up, straight on, no lie brigades in a hurry, you do what the Army and the Marine Corps always do, they task organize, right? So they just take active battalions from another brigade and fill a brigade out. But you could have kept that 40-some-odd brigade structure, which I think is absolutely right, and just rounded it out with a battalion from the reserve component.
Any questions? Yeah, please.
Jordan Nicholas Matt of the Canadian Embassy. So thank you to all the panelists. It was a great conference. And my question is addressed to all of you, but I guess more specifically to Frank Hoffman, who alluded to the pivot to Asia. Now, you mentioned that America had to rebalance towards Asia and had to do so in concordance with other Asian countries. We don't think of Canada that way often, but Canada is also a Pacific country. And I wanted to see if there was any plans by the US military to work with the Canadian government in its rebalancing actions. And this could also expand to other non-Asian countries. So the pivot to Asia being not just a specifically Asian action, but also a North American at-large plan.
I think you're sticky, Frank.
Yeah, I wanted to say something about, I wish the Canadians were in the Stanley Cup playoffs. I won't be able to say Rangers and Habs go at it, but Canada. I do have, tonight's the first game tonight, so, I know 2 of us that'll be where we'll be tonight, right? Well, clearly, operating in the Pacific is an alliance activity, not an American-only kind of activity. In fact, we're interested in getting some of our NATO and European allies interested in the Pacific too, because everybody has interest there. That's where the challenges lie, and that's where I think the economic opportunities and I think the greatest destabilizing factors, whether it's North Korea or whether it's China. I'm very pessimistic about China, so I see Canada having interest, I see Japan having interest, I see South Korea having more interest than it realizes. Clearly the Vietnamese and the Philippines understand this, and the Australians understand that. I'm disappointed I didn't see a photo opportunity last week when Mr. Hagel was out at Shangri-La, but if he'd been standing there with the Australian Prime Minister, your leadership, and the Japanese Prime Minister and the Secretary of Defense all there holding hands with a maple leaf flag in the background, that would have been nice. Or maybe we get Mr. Hagel now with a hockey stick this week and make up for that and ship him up to, unfortunately it won't be Montreal, but which would have been my preferred team. But no, it's Canada does have a place, and Canada is a Pacific power, and Canada does have interests from the Arctic, energy flows, and economic opportunities. So it's part of the game.
I just want to add to that. First of all, let me just formally thank the Canadians for everything they've done over the last 14 years. They've borne a lot of burdens alongside us in allied efforts around the world, and so I'm very appreciative of that. I think that the U.S.-Canada relationship is interesting in that both it's Pacific power, but also, I've mentioned this very briefly, but look, there are going to be problems in the Arctic, right? And I know actually to a certain extent, and it's going to probably manifest itself more initially as an air and maritime sort of issue. And I know that's very important to your government. And so I think that one of the places for U.S.-Canadian cooperation is going to, as we look forward into the security future, is going to be sort of on what we do about the security of territory and interests in the Arctic as one thing. And I also think, just as a small point, that Canada is one of those armies I talked about in my final point that alongside the British, the French, the Australians, our sort of regional partners, the Republic of Korea, Japan, et cetera. I mean, those are those, armies that still field some capability that we need to maintain a very close relationship with, because 9 times out of 10 our interests coincide, and therefore we may have an opportunity once again to sort of combine our ground force efforts to make a much more potent force.
Okay, in the back?
Lloyd Solis from the University of Maryland, and also write for the Philippine Daily Inquirer. With the recent visit of President Obama to Asia, and with the signing of an agreement with President Aquino, with the Visiting Forces Agreement, and since we are talking right now of ground warfare, does this mean that the Visiting Forces Agreement on the U.S. side would also engage in ground warfare, especially with the Muslim separatist problems in the South Philippines, and also the Communist Party of the Philippines, which is until now still active? And at the same time, does that mean also that the disputed islands in the West Philippine Sea between China and the Philippines, would that be part of the exercises between U.S. forces and Philippine forces? Thanks.
I'm not, since I'm not currently in government, I'm not privy to any of the plans. But I do think the Visiting Forces Agreement, provides for U.S. forces to conduct training in the Philippines. We are already engaged in Mindanao with the Joint Special Operations Task Force, but I think it's clear that American forces are not going to directly engage in operations in the Moro problems with the ASG. It's not appropriate. And the Philippine military is actually doing very well in those very complex and difficult fights down there. The communists, that is, of course, a major threat to the Philippines. But again, I think the Philippine military is dealing with that, and our indirect support through training, foreign military sales, and the like, it does assist the Philippine military in those areas. The disputed territories, I think that all of that is really covered by treaty alliance and then campaign plans, and not by the Visiting Forces Agreement. So I think you have to look at that from an alliance perspective on and what our two governments will determine is the right course of action given whatever threats may arise.
Actually, let me take the prerogative of the chair and ask a question to all three of you. The discussion sometime earlier this morning was about the forces going even below, I think maybe it's me, okay, sorry, Frank, even below, so 390 vice 420 vice 450. At some point, and this 390 might be the point, you clearly can't cover the waterfront the way we've been discussing it, whether it's, the 5 these, the 7 that, the 1.5 wars and all the rest. So at that kind, if you were the advisor, all three of you, what would you recommend as the fundamental change that the chief should advocate? Obviously, I think it to the Joint Chiefs, to the Secretary, in the focus of the Army, once it falls below that critical number. Would you just do war fighting? Would you, or give that to the Guard as another option and sort of say, I can't go to war until I mobilize everybody? How would you respond in terms of a choice of either missions or structure? And I won't give you the option of simply saying you're going to continue to do everything at smaller and smaller numbers. Mm-hmm. Essentially, at that number, you break it if you try and do it all. So what do you do that's different fundamentally?
Well, I think that's the key word, fundamentally. What are the fundamentals? And that's what we'll have to focus on, blocking and tackling. I think Nate had some great words there on grab, hold, punch. But I think that, we will be doing less with less. And I think that's the real answer. But I think we've got to focus on the fundamentals. I think the combat fundamentals are the foundation: shoot, move, and communicate. Be able to tactically employ our brigade combat teams. If we focus on that, I have a lot of confidence in our soldiers that they'll be able to adapt to other requirements. If we focus on other requirements, then we will, I think we will really make ourselves even more vulnerable and at higher risk if we don't have the foundational combat skills that the Army must have.
That is a great question, actually, because that is the question. And it causes me a little bit of, it's causing me a little bit of angst, only because
Yeah,
right now, I mean, I think everybody would agree that if you look at that defeat, deny construct, right? The deny is at its highest level of intensity, is some kind of coercive campaign against a major power with sophisticated military capabilities who poses a anti-access area denial threat to the United States. Now, I'm just gonna let you pick who that is. And that the defeat right now is probably, if I were a betting man, again, I'm not privy to the exact precise discussions that went into this, but I'd be, I think, pretty safe to bet a paycheck that the defeat is North Korea, right? The problem with that latter consideration is you have the benefit of the South Koreans in that,
Yes.
in that proposition. I mean, that is the problem with that being your most stressful case, is that you actually have the benefit of having a very significant, large, conventional, and capable ally in place waiting for you when you get off the boats at the dock to conduct the operation with. So if I were on the verge of not being able, if I've had a force that I thought would not be able to do all of the things that I had constructed it to do, I think, and this goes a little bit against my better judgment, but I think that I would recommend that it has to be, your pacer has to be something other than North Korea, if that makes sense to you. So I have to be able to go in to the president and say, the pacer is, sort of broad front, irregular and traditional opposition by the Russians in Eastern Europe, or something of that ilk that gives me the flexing capability to conduct conventional operations to secure at-risk sort of infrastructure and territory and populations from the things that were described by David, the proxy problems. And I would say that's the base case, and I got to be able to get it there. I got to be able to get it there on a timeline, because I think that will invariably give you more of a demand signal than the Korea scenario that benefits from a partner.
I'm not sure quite what the scenario is for the Army being broken, but,
never too low.
the fiscal reality is the bottom end of what's in the QDR, the 420 is now the ceiling, given what the administration has asked for. They asked for $26 billion for a readiness plug. It's not happening. They asked for $115 billion across the fit-up above sequestration. That's not going to happen. So that's already at the Army at 420 and less. And they're not going to get the Apache. We're not going to get the Guard changes. We're not going to get the ICBM changes. We're not going to get the U-2 changes. We're not going to get a BRAC. We're not going to get compensation reform. We're not going to get TRICARE reform. So
Other than that,
you subtract those dollars out, and the Army's at 390, but there's probably still a 4-division, 20 brigade combat capability. Add a Marine division to that. You've got a major theater war, deterrent, go-win capability, plus alliances, plus you will again gamble more on the reserves and the National Guard coming to bear. You may reorganize things. You'll only go to war with the Canadians and the Brits and somebody together, and not during the Stanley Cup playoffs, because everybody in Canada is going to be like me tonight, drinking bad beer and watching Americans play hockey, unfortunately. Sorry about that. But where we're at right now is, we're still, particularly, we got the world's finest Air Force, the world's finest Navy. We've got global reach. We've got transoceanic power projection. We've got probably getting closer to parity in space and ISR more than we'd want to admit. But today we field basically a 1 million-man land Army, 500,000 in the Army, 180 something in the Marine Corps. 300-400K between the National Guard and the Reserve. It's a pretty complicated capability. It's going to come down substantially, but we still have a lot. It'll be a very effective combined arms force We will give up some things as we get smaller. I would imagine it would be in forward presence. We would not be in Europe. We would not be in South Korea. We'll train, we'll be interoperable, we'll meet our treaty commitments by coming 30 days too late after war starts perhaps or something, but we'll still come. We just won't be as deterring, we won't be as reassuring to those allies, unfortunately. We'll have to give up things in engineering, we'll give up things in command and control, in corps headquarters, take a 2-division Marine Corps instead of a notional 3-division Marine Corps, and we'll have to trade off things. And we'll get very efficient on roles and missions. We will not be as resilient or interdependent. We'll just have a little more stovepiping, a little less readiness.
All right, we're coming close to the witching hour, so if there are no more questions or comments in the audience, I will ask you all to join me in thanking the panelists, and we'll take a break.
Just terrific. As Dr. Gray mentioned, we'll take a bit of a break, about 15 minutes at 3:30, 15:30 for you military types. Reconvene for air power, and again, another distinguished panel, and looking forward to your questions. Thank you.